Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking closely at an essay called Why Socialism by none other than Albert Einstein,
Written in 1949.
right in the thick of the early Cold War.
Yeah, the world was holding its breath, wondering what was going to happen next.
And in the middle of all of that, even a brilliant physicist like Einstein was thinking about the big
It's
questions
about society.
about how things should work.
Exactly.
Now, you might be surprised to hear this, but at one point, Einstein actually brings up pirates to make his point.
Seriously.
I know, right? And that's where we're going to start today.
Okay, so Einstein opens the essay with this conversation he had where someone just casually mentions the human race disappearing.
Almost like it's no big deal.
Yeah, like it's just another Tuesday or something.
It's kind of a dark way to start off an essay, don't you think?
I think so.
It really
Yeah.
makes you wonder why he chose to lead with such a chilling thought.
Well, I think that opening anecdote really gets to the heart of Einstein's anxieties about the world at that time.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, he's basically pointing out this sense of detachment from each other.
This idea that people are becoming so isolated?
Exactly. So isolated that even the thought of humanity disappearing doesn't really faze them.
Wow.
So it's like he's saying, look, if we lose sight of what connects us as human beings.
And what's left to hold society together?
Right. And that leads him to this central question that he keeps coming back to in the essay.
Which is,
What happens to our sense of shared purpose?
when everybody's just focused on individual success?
Especially when that success might come at the expense of other people.
That's a really interesting point, and that's where he starts to lay out his critique of capitalism.
Exactly. He sees capitalism as this system that kind of forces people to compete with each other.
Creating winners and losers.
Yeah, constantly fostering that survival of the fittest mentality.
So he's not just talking about economics here. He's talking about, like, the fundamental values of a society.
That's right. The very fabric of how we interact with each other.
He actually uses this phrase,
Cultural constitution.
yes, to describe all of that.
All those beliefs and values that shape how a society functions.
It's like he's saying our cultural constitution is kind of like the DNA of society.
Determining how healthy and resilient it is.
I like that analogy.
And what's really interesting is that he argues that, unlike our biology,
Which is pretty much fixed.
our cultural constitution is something that can change.
They can adapt it.
Exactly. We have the power to shape it.
So that makes a lot of sense. But if we can choose to change those things about society, what's holding us back?
He does point to a few things that he believes are essentially unchangeable in modern times.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest ones is high population density.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. We're all kind of packed in together
And then there's the need for specialized labor.
because everybody can't do everything right.
Exactly. So you need people with specific skills and knowledge.
But he's saying that those conditions actually create a lot of pressure on society.
Right. It inevitably leads to competition and inequality.
So even if we really wanted to make a more just and equitable society, those challenges would still be there hanging over us.
It's true, but it's at this point in the essay that he starts talking about socialism as a potential way forward.
He actually goes out of his way to make a distinction between what he calls a planned economy.
And true socialism.
Now, why is that distinction so important to him?
We see Einstein argues that a planned economy is basically just where the government controls production and distribution.
Okay, so they decide who makes what and who gets what.
Exactly. But the thing is, that kind of system can exist under all sorts of political ideology.
Even authoritarian ones.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with democracy or freedom or any of that.
But when he talks about true socialism,
That's when he gets into the ethical principles behind it.
so it's not just about who's in charge, it's about the values driving the decisions.
Exactly. So for Einstein, it's really about putting human needs and well-being above profit.
And individual gain.
Yeah, it's about creating a system that actually gives everyone a chance to contribute and then share in the rewards.
And I remember reading that Einstein wasn't totally naive about socialism either.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't.
He had the pretty big reservations about it.
Oh, absolutely. He knew that it wasn't some kind of utopian dream.
He was really worried about what he called bureaucratic tyranny.
That's right. He saw the potential for socialism to turn into something that actually stifles freedom and creativity.
If it falls into the wrong hands.
Exactly. It's like that old saying about power corrupting.
And absolute power corrupting, absolutely.
So he was aware of that tension between trying to make things more equal.
And protecting individual liberty.
It's a tough balance to strike.
Like walking a tightrope.
And Einstein doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
He just lays out the complexities.
Yeah, he acknowledges that finding the right balance is incredibly difficult.
So no easy solutions.
Not at all.
So let's get down to the nuts and bolts here. What did Einstein actually propose as the key elements of a socialist system?
Well, he starts with a few basic principles.
Okay, like what?
The first one is social ownership of the means of production.
So instead of having private companies or individuals owning factories and farms and all that,
It would be owned by society as a whole.
that's a pretty radical departure from capitalism, isn't it?
It is, but it gets to the heart of Einstein's critique of capitalism.
How so?
Well, he believed that private ownership basically inevitably leads to an unequal distribution of wealth and power.
Some people have a lot.
And some people have very little.
So social ownership is kind of the foundation.
It is.
What else did he propose?
The second thing he talked about was production being geared towards meeting people's needs.
Instead of just maximizing profits,
Right. So the goal wouldn't be to just make as much money as possible.
it would be to make sure that everybody has what they need to live a good life.
Things like food, housing, healthcare, education.
That sounds like a pretty big promise.
Correct.
How would a socialist system actually deliver on that?
Well, that leads to his third point, guaranteed work and a basic livelihood for everyone.
Okay, so everybody who can work.
Would be guaranteed a job that pays a living wage.
That kind of reminds me of the idea of a universal basic income.
Except it's tied to work.
So you still have to contribute to society.
But you're also guaranteed a certain standard of living.
I can see how that could be really motivating for people.
Especially if they feel like their work has a real purpose.
Like they're actually making a difference.
Exactly. And then the last key element Einstein emphasizes is an education system that promotes social responsibility.
So instead of just focusing on individual achievement,
It would be about preparing people to be good citizens,
to care about their community.
then to think critically about the world around them.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different aspects of socialism as Einstein saw it. But let's be real for a second.
Yep.
There are a lot of people out there who hear the word socialism and they immediately shut down.
Yeah, they have a very negative reaction to it.
They associate it with big government and economic inefficiency and a loss of individual freedom.
You know, like breadlines and gulags.
What would Einstein say to those concerns?
Well, I think he would actually agree with some of those concerns.
Really?
Yeah. Remember, he was very worried about the potential for what he called bureaucratic tyranny.
Right, there was a major concern for him.
And that's exactly why he stresses the importance of having safeguards to protect individual liberties.
And to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of a few.
It's not about blindly trusting the government to solve all our problems.
It's about creating systems that hold the government accountable.
And empowering people to participate in shaping their own destinies.
That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like Einstein's vision of socialism was really about more than just economics.
Yeah, it was about reclaiming our shared humanity.
And recognizing our interconnectedness.
Exactly. He saw it as a path towards a more just equitable and fulfilling society.
One that values cooperation and compassion over competition and greed. Wow, that's a powerful thought.
It is, and it brings us back to that image he starts the essay with.
The potential for humanity to just disappear,
Not through some cataclysmic event.
but through a gradual erosion of our values and connections.
Yeah, it's like a slow fade to black.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
And it raises a really important question for all of us.
What kind of world do we want to leave behind?
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially with all the challenges we're facing today as a global society, like climate change and wealth inequality and the rise of AI. I mean, what do you think Einstein would say about all of that?
That is a really interesting question to consider.
It is, isn't it? I mean, remember he was writing this essay right after World War II.
Yeah, with the threat of nuclear war hanging over everyone's heads.
Exactly. He'd seen firsthand how destructive unchecked nationalism and greed could be.
Absolutely.
And it's funny you brought up that pirate analogy earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Because it almost feels like he saw those same forces at play in the economic systems of his time.
You know, you're absolutely right. It's almost like he was saying that some parts of capitalism actually encourage that kind of pirate mentality.
Like a winner-take-all kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. He was actually really influenced by the work of this economist named Thorstein Veblen,
I've heard of him.
who wrote about what he called the predatory phase of capitalism.
So he was basically saying that capitalism actually incentivizes aggression and exploitation in some ways.
Kind of like a survival of the fittest, but in the economic realm.
Wow. So even though Einstein saw socialism as a potential solution, He wasn't naive about the fact that it could also be vulnerable to those same human
Of
flaws.
course not. I
Yeah.
mean, remember how much he emphasized the need for safeguards against things like bureaucratic tyranny and the concentration of power?
Right. He knew that any system could be corrupted no matter how well-intentioned it might be.
Exactly. And that's why he kept stressing the need for accountability and transparency in any kind of socialist system.
So it's not just about putting all your faith in the government and hoping they'll do the right thing.
Right. No way it's about making sure that power is distributed and that there are checks and balances in place.
And that people have a real voice in shaping their own society.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot between collective action and individual freedom.
Hmm. That's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, how do you balance those two things without sacrificing one for the other?
It's a question that every generation has to grapple with, I think.
And it feels even more urgent now considering the scale of the challenges we're up against.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from Einstein's essay is that we can't afford to be complacent.
We have to keep questioning and keep searching for better ways to organize ourselves.
To create a more just and sustainable world.
And that's really what these deep dives are all about, isn't it? It's not just about learning about what someone like Einstein thought,
It's about using those ideas as a springboard for our own thinking.
to spark new conversations and explore different possibilities.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe somewhere out there right now, there's another brilliant mind working on the next big idea.
The one that will finally help us solve some of these seemingly intractable problems.
That would be amazing.
Yours, wouldn't it? Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up our deep dive into why socialism.
Okay.
I have to say, it's left me feeling both hopeful and kind of overwhelmed at the same time.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
We have so much power to shape the future, but the responsibility that comes with that is pretty daunting.
It is. But hey, at least we're having these conversations, Rick.
That's true. That's true. So thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll catch you next time on another deep dive into something thought-provoking.
Sounds good.
Until then, keep those brain gears turning, folks, and we'll see you soon.